morning, this evening. As astrology has a lot of dates in, I don't expect you to remember them, just like I don't remember them, so I'm going to just mention them from a piece of paper. But to me, actually move to the camera slightly. Thanks. So I'm going to go back to 1989. It was a long time ago. I was in Germany. I just finished my university studies. I'm from South Africa, and I kind of delayed having to go into the apartheid military, which was, a conscription. Everyone had to go in by 5 years by first going to university. So by the time I needed to go in, which was 1990, it had been reduced to 1 year. But before that, I went to Europe on holiday, and this was November, December 1989. And the most incredible thing happened on the 9th of November 1989. The Berlin Wall fell down. And the fall of communism was something that no one could have predicted. When I was in Germany, I actually was in a little border town, which was quite an amazing experience, because what Germany did was they gave what they called Begrüßungsgeld, which means greeting money, to the West Germans as they came into East Germany. And I walked into town one day, in this little town. I was visiting a friend, and there were all these little, they were called Trabants, these little box-shaped two-stroke engine vehicles that the East Germans used to drive. They were all parked outside the cheap supermarket, and all the East Germans were spending their money. And I went into a store, and I was looking through the CDs, and the woman came, the shopkeeper came up to me, and she said to me, obviously in German, she said, "It's a CD. You need a CD player for it." And I said, "Yes, I know, yeah, nice." So why I'm telling that story was that this was a shift from a state of the world to a whole new state. And I mentioned I'm from South Africa because I went back in January of 1989 and had to go to, thankfully I didn't go to the army, because the army was the last place I wanted to go to, because it was being used by the South African government to enforce apartheid, and the troops were being sent into the townships. And I mean, the late 80s in South Africa was a pretty scary place. In fact, in 1986, my father and I, in this little town outside of Johannesburg where my parents lived, we walked past a fast food store, walked past another store, stood in the queue for the ATM, and as we stood in the queue of the ATM, a bomb in the fast food store went off and blew up the whole fast food. I just remember stuff shooting out the window. I remember I have an image in my mind of a baby covered in blood, people running away. That was the state of South Africa. Like, this apartheid system looked like it would never change. The violence was just increasing. And then in February 1990, I actually missed the whole event because I was in basic training in the Navy, but Nelson Mandela was released from prison. So suddenly, in this spate of a few months, all of these communist regimes in Europe just started falling, and apartheid ended, and we saw an amazing change in the zeitgeist, in the sort of world view that had been prevalent for so long. And what's fascinating with all of these shifts, I mean, I'm now 55, and if I look back over the last 30, 40 years, how the world has changed. I mean, I have a son who's turning 15 next week, and I say to him, when I was 15, we barely had computers, and now he's like busy planning his latest upgrade with the most advanced computer. He's mining Bitcoin on his computer, and he's doing all kinds of amazing things. The world has seen radical shifts in the last few years. And 1989, the planets Uranus and Saturn, 1988, planets Uranus and Saturn came together in the sky. And then Saturn and Neptune came together in the sky. Literally, they were exactly together on the 13th of November 1989 as the Berlin Wall fell. Now Neptune as a planet represents ideologies, and it represents sort of illusions and sort of concepts, and Saturn represents structures. And when Saturn and Neptune come together, it's the principle of sort of structure and authority and old systems coming together with dissolving boundaries. And we saw, something as solid as the Berlin Wall being pushed over and destroyed. So whenever there are these major changes around the world, we see an alignment of the planets. There's an amazing new documentary series that's just been released. It's a 10-11 part docu-series. It's called Changing of the Gods. And it's all based upon the work of a very interesting... Originally, he kind of made his presence in the world as a philosopher and a psychologist called Rick Tarnas. And he sort of secretly studied astrology, and then he released a book to the world called Cosmos and Psyche. But his first book is called, what's it called now? But basically it's all about the mindset of the Western mind, the philosophy of the Western mind. It's actually a prescribed textbook in university, so it's very well recognized. And then he wrote this book which really started looking at the alignments of the outer planets. So really Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. When those planets come into an alignment relative to the Earth, typically of 90 degrees, 180 degrees, or come together, there's major change in the air. So I was born in 1967, and that was the alignment of Pluto and Uranus. And it was a time of revolution, because what Uranus as a planet is all about, Uranus is known in astrology as the Great Awakener. It's the planet of revolution. And whenever Uranus is involved in the picture, and I'll give you a few examples just now, how often Uranus comes into an alignment with some other planet, and we see some kind of revolutionary shift and change on the planet. And Uranus is this really fascinating planet. It was discovered in 1781, and shortly thereafter, 1789 was the start of the French Revolution, was the American Revolution, the Industrial Revolution. So the planet Uranus is kind of linked with revolutionary energy. And Uranus as a planet is really fascinating, because it's the only planet in our solar system that rotates in the opposite direction. And it's 90 degrees off the vertical, whereas like Earth is 23 and a half. So it's this like maverick energy that just, and I call Uranus the Great Awakener. And I'm going to bring Uranus into the story some more as we continue this sort of astrological story. So as we kind of embark into astrology, we have to first kind of get past one of the big tripping things that trips up scientists about astrology, and that's like, how can a planet millions and millions of miles away have any effect on me on Earth? When a baby's born, there's more gravitational effect from the doctor holding the baby, delivering the baby, than the planet Pluto. So that the first step, and that's what really confuses people, is astrology is not a causal system. There's no cause relationship between where a planet is and what's happening on Earth. But there's a correlative link. And the correlative link is something that we can now explain a lot more in the understanding of quantum physics. What they discovered with quantum physics over the last sort of 120 years, since the early 1900s, when quantum physics was really being understood, is that we have what's known as non-local correlation, so that particles can be interconnected, but they don't communicate with one another in the traditional way of sending messages. And we have what's called quantum teleportation or quantum non-local correlation. And that to me is something of what's happening with astrology and the planets. So that's just an important thing to kind of keep in mind. I mean, in our English language, we tend to use the words the effect of this, or Mercury went retrograde, so this happened. And we just think in terms of there's a cause and effect relationship, but it's not, there's a correlation. And this goes back to an ancient maxim, which probably many people are familiar with, is the as above, so below, as within, so without. So what we saw in 1989 was this alignment of Saturn came together with Uranus, and Saturn came together with Neptune in 89. In 1988 we had Saturn conjunct Uranus. So there we had the principle. Saturn always represents the old system. Saturn always represents things of structure, keeping things the same, authoritarian systems, and Uranus is this maverick energy coming together, and we saw communism shift. So that was an incredible time in history. I mean, I was right there, seeing it happen, and living through the release of Nelson Mandela, which people thought would never ever happen. And then, we can all probably remember where we were on 9/11, 2001. I remember I was at work in an office and they had a tiny little black and white TV like this, and I remember seeing, the image of a plane flying into a building. I'm not going to go down the route of whether it really was a plane or not, that's for another discussion. But on that day, Saturn was exactly in opposition to the planet Pluto. Now, planet Pluto is this tiny little planet that actually got demoted by astronomers to be a non-planet, and now there's a kind of movement to bring it back to make it a planet again, but it's kind of irrelevant. In astrology, Pluto actually turns out to be one of the most incredibly powerful let's not use the word cause and effect, but we can see Pluto in such incredible. So Pluto represents tyranny, power, death, and rebirth. And what did we see on that day? We saw, Saturn, which represents structure. Saturn is also the planet that represents finance and systems to do with finance. And then we saw the World Trade Center, destruction coming into play on that day. And that set off a number of things, the war on terror, and set off a whole kind of way of, and we know a lot happened from that whole war of terror thing. But the next interesting alignment, which is part of our story, which is going to bring us to our very recent memory, and that's 2020 and the whole coronavirus pandemic. And that was the alignment of Jupiter and Saturn. It's called the Grand Conjunction. It happens every 20 years. So in the year 2000, we had an alignment of Jupiter and Saturn. Now, Jupiter and Saturn had been watched by ancient astrologers for thousands of years. Before they knew about the existence of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, they looked at Jupiter and Saturn, and they saw this alignment that took place every 20 years, and they observed, and whenever Jupiter and Saturn came together, there was a shift in the global zeitgeist, in the whole political structure. So we astrologers knew already in 2018, 2019 that 2020 was going to be a societal reset. A major event was going to happen in 2020. But there's a few other alignments that happened in 2020 that kind of made 2020 this year we'll all look back to and say, wow, what happened? But back to the year 2000. 2000, we saw the dot-com bubble burst. There was a number of alignments in 2000. There was a whole cluster of planets all aligned in Taurus in May. And Taurus is also a sign of the zodiac that's connected with finance. So we saw this massive peak in the NASDAQ index, and then within a few months there was this massive crash. So there was this alignment of planets, and it brought about a change. In many ways, also, what happened in 2000, pretty much at the time of that conjunction, was George Bush very much stole the election from Al Gore through a final court case taking place at the Supreme Court in Florida, where Bush's brother was the governor. So You know, you kind of like, and that set, I believe, the course for 9/11 to take place. But that's a whole nother discussion. I just wanted to show you that all these alignments start taking place. Then I remember I gave a talk in 2007 about Pluto. Pluto, who takes 246 years to go around the sun, was about to change from the sign of Scorpio into Capricorn. And I remember giving that talk and saying that we are entering a period where there's going to be a radical transformation of the global financial system. What happened in 2007, 2008? Well, there was the subprime issue, and there was a major crash and a major recession came into play. And then something else really interesting happened in 2008. An unknown entity called Nakamoto Satoshi published a white paper called the Bitcoin White Paper in 2008. And what's fascinating about, here we have the planet Pluto, which represents death, rebirth, and total transformation, enters into the sign of Capricorn, which represents the global financial system, and it says transformation and change is coming to the global economy. We have a collapse, and at the same time, no one knows about it, but we have the birth of something called Bitcoin, which we all know about. And this took place, and what's super fascinating is if you look at the astrology charts for the United States dollar, the actual birth chart for the United States, I'm using just the sun signs. You take the sun sign of Capricorn, of Bitcoin, which is in Capricorn, and you take the sun sign for the United States, which happens to be in Cancer, because the 4th of July is when the sun is in Cancer. The sun for the United States chart and the sun for Bitcoin are exactly opposite one another in the sky. And exactly at 90 degrees to that is the astrology chart for the Chinese currency, and opposite to that is the chart for the actual US dollar when the US dollar was founded. So we have a picture, an astrological picture in the sky, which shows Bitcoin, the United States, Chinese currency, and the US dollar all making like a cross in the sky. And whenever we see a cross in astrology of planets, it's a major tension point, and it's a point of that there's something that's going to give and there's going to be a big shift. So we can see already that, astrologically there's this correlation in the sky that's telling us something about Bitcoin, telling us something about the United States, telling us about the US dollar, telling us about the Chinese currency. So we are in the end of an empire, where it's the end of the American empire and it's the rise of the Chinese empire. Ray Dalio has written a book. He's a very well-known, famous billionaire investor. He's written a book called Principles, and then he wrote a recent book called Principles about the coming changing world order. And he goes through historically looking at all the empires, and we are in the end where the US dollar, and we'll get into the US dollar in a little bit more detail, but this 2008 financial crisis and the entry of Pluto into Capricorn. Now Pluto entered in 2008 into Capricorn, and Pluto is about to exit Capricorn next year in 2023. And we make a little retrograde movement back into Capricorn, but essentially by 2024, Pluto is going to be firmly into the sign of Aquarius. Now I'll talk about what Aquarius means in a moment. So we've been in a slow journey of transformation of the global economy, and we're seeing it. We see that so if I go back to when I was born in 1967, we had this incredible time in history when there was revolution, there was the Vietnam War, there were protests, there was free love, there was the hippie movement, there was massive protests, there was protests for black rights, for women's rights, for environmental movement. All of this started in the 1960s, 66, 65 through to sort of 72. That period of time, Pluto and Uranus were together in the sky. That cycle of Pluto and Uranus is fascinating, and this is what this Rick Tarnas has really looked at in his book, and now this new series that's just been published called Changing the Gods is really worth watching, because it really in very visual terms shows you this correlations throughout history of how history repeats itself. So the Uranus Pluto cycle, and maybe it's kind of interesting just to sort of just draw a picture. So Uranus, and this is the astrology symbol for Uranus and Pluto, they were together in what's known as a conjunction. And then over time, Uranus is the faster moving planet. They move into what's known as a square aspect relative to this is Earth. We're in the center here. They make a square aspect, and then after the square aspect, they'll make. We'll talk about it. This is known as a trine. It's 120 degrees. Uranus and Pluto go into a trine aspect, and then eventually they'll go into an opposition aspect. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But where we are at from the 1960s, when Uranus and Pluto were together, we're now just coming out of the period from 2007 to 2020. They were making a square aspect to one another. So in many ways, the themes of the 1960s were now being again brought into focus. And we saw, in 2017, 2018, 2019, massive protests were taking place. I mean, in Hong Kong, we had massive protests for democracy in 2019. And isn't it kind of strange? It's suddenly a thing called Corona just came, and that just stopped all those protests. In France, we had the yellow vests having massive protests as well. So there were all these protest movements. There was Black Lives Matter. There was, even before that, we had the Wall Street, and people were looking at suddenly like there's this total inequality. So we're in this long period where Pluto is, came in 2008 into Capricorn, and he moves out in 2023. And Pluto's saying there's going to be this radical change in the global financial system. And in this time period, from 2007 to 2020, we have Uranus and Pluto making an aspect, what's known as a hard aspect. In other words, the energies conflict with one another, and it's bringing up again this sense of like people demanding change. So then suddenly, we out of nowhere, 2020, again we have planetary alignments. We have the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which again happens every 20 years, which took place in December 2020, and along with that, in January 2020, we had Saturn together with Pluto, and in April 2020, we had Jupiter together with Pluto. So we had all these alignments in 2020, which, if you want to sort of unpack them further, Pluto is a principle of death. So we saw pandemic, we saw death, we saw conflicts. April 2020 was the peak of the first wave of the coronavirus. Jupiter, the planet of expansion, the biggest planet in our solar system, coming together with the principle of death. So we saw massive, cases of people dying from coronavirus in April 2020. But the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, just in at 0 degrees of Aquarius, is a telling signature for us of what is this big event of 2020 all about? Like, what really, obviously, we're going to be talking about coronavirus pandemic for years to come. But from my perspective of astrology, it's for me always to go back and look at the stars and say, okay, what was the alignment? What is it all about? And what's fascinating to me is that, well, firstly, from this big grand conjunction, this alignment of Jupiter and Saturn, which takes place every 20 years, had been taking place for 20 years, every 20 years in what's known as Earth signs. So in 2000 it was in the sign of Capricorn. Now, in 2020, it was in Aquarius, which is an air sign. So it's interesting, we had a whole thing to do with air, lungs, but it's a signature of the sign of Aquarius, because, and not only now, we're entering every 800 years, these planets stay in the same star sign. So they change every 800 years. So now for the next 200 years, we will have Jupiter and Saturn will come together in an air sign. So it could be Aquarius, it could be Gemini, it could be Libra, but they are air sign. So there's this sort of principle of air, and air is to do with the mind, and earth signs are to do with kind of practicalities, to do with the earth, to do with the material realm. So there's this signature of saying we are needing to move to a higher state. And why I mention this higher state is that throughout this, we get the signatures of Uranus. Uranus, as I said, is known as the Great Awakener, or he's the great magician who brings about unexpected changes and brings about sort of magical magnetic shifts in reality. And it's this conflict with Uranus, that we've been seeing, particularly last year. There was so much, and it's still this year. We've got Saturn square Uranus into this year as well, and it was particularly exact last year. We saw a lot of the old god Saturn. Saturn is authority, the old god. Uranus is new revolutionary things conflicting with one another. And what did we see last year? What are we seeing this year? We're seeing all of this, lockdowns. Thankfully, they seem to be coming to an end. All of this lockdown and all of this rules and regulations around dealing with the pandemic, and people, protesting against it. We see, the massive protest in Canada with the truckers, and how that, all kinds of the authoritarian structures of the Canadian government invoking all kinds of unused laws to suppress it, and people finding innovative ways to break through this blockade, using cryptocurrency. So we're in this time of great struggle where this Uranian energy of awakening is like kind of pulsing. There's this like pulse on the planet to say it's time to awaken, it's time to awaken. Another very fascinating astrological signature that's just kicked in on the 22nd of February this year. The United States as a country, so just like you and I have birth charts, a country has a birth chart. So the United States was born on the 4th of July 1776. And it's been 246 years since then, and Pluto has returned to the same spot. And whenever a planet returns, it's a momentous event. Once a year, you each have a sun return called a birthday, and we celebrate that and we say many happy returns. Well, the United States is having a Pluto return, and people don't have Pluto returns because for right now we don't live to 246 years, but nations have Pluto returns. And whenever nations in the past have had their Pluto returns, there's been a death and a rebirth of that nation. So not only is the United States now in this astrological signature of a death and a rebirth, but it's actually taking place in the house. So astrology charts are divided into what's called houses, and each house is a certain area of life. And this Pluto return to the United States is in the house of money and wealth and value. So just from that alone, we can say there is a transformation coming to the United States in terms of everything to do with the economy. And we know that the United States is the dominant economic system that is on this planet. The most incredible thing since the corona pandemic is that 80% of all US dollars in circulation today were printed in the last 2 years. 80%. I mean, it's beyond comprehension. And all of that is doing is, devaluing the currency to such an extent. I mean, the inflation in the United States is higher than ever before. The real inflation rate is way beyond what the official inflation rate is. So we are sitting in a situation where, how much longer can the United States prop up its economy through printing of money? And most economists say that we're heading towards a major recession. And that to me, does correlate with Pluto's movement through Capricorn. Because as planets move through a star sign and they hit eventually the final degree of the star sign, the 29th degree, astrologers have a lovely word which no one really has explained to me in all my years of studying astrology. They call it the anaretic degree, 29 degrees. It's this, like the full intensity of that star sign is coming to be. And Pluto is right now at 29 degrees and will move backwards a bit. But basically the next year or so, Pluto is going to move over that 29 degrees. So the full force of Pluto's transformative power, coupled with the meaning of Capricorn, which is to do with the global economy, is coming to the fore. It's like we are living within the last days of this global financial system. Coupled together with what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, and the sanctions against Russia, and China now saying that they want to start selling and buying oil in their currency, because the United States has always had the advantage over any other country in the world, is that all transactions of petroleum had to be done in US dollars. So the clearing, it was basically nobody was allowed globally to buy or sell and pay other than in US dollars. So even China had to buy oil from the Saudis and whoever they bought, and from the Russians, and pay in dollars. And that gave the United States an unfair advantage over any other country. But now this is changing, and this is all going to impact upon the sort of economic system that's kind of in place. What's fascinating for me is that if we take, this is the one thing which I do in my crypto astrology group, is that we take the Bitcoin chart and we study intensely to see what are the planetary movements coming to the Bitcoin chart, and how can that tell us when Bitcoin price is going to go up or Bitcoin price is going to go down. And what's fascinating is that next month, the planet Pluto comes close to the Bitcoin Jupiter, but then it moves away. And then next year, Pluto will move right onto the Bitcoin Jupiter. Why that is so interesting for me is that in the charts, the birth charts of many, many billionaires, if you take Bill Gates, if you take Elon Musk, if you take Michael Saylor, who's well known for his investments in Bitcoin, they all have a Jupiter-Pluto signature. So it's kind of called in astrology the signature of the billionaire, the wealth signature. So now we're going to have Bitcoin have a wealth signature. So my prediction is that in 2023, Bitcoin is going to at least 10 times its current value. And I think, this is correlating with what we're seeing is that, the US dollar is in decline. The Chinese are, I think everyone's very worried. Is China going to make a move on Taiwan? How's that going to affect, there's a lot of signatures. I mean, just yesterday, North Korea launched an intercontinental ballistic missile, which is illegal. But I find that such a funny term that, we can term a weapon to be illegal. And it's termed illegal by the people who have the intercontinental ballistic nuclear missiles. But anyway, that's an aside. It just amused me. But it seems to me that, there's there's a lot of tension building up in the world. We don't know where the situation in Russia and Ukraine is going to go, but it's all from an astrological perspective. I'm seeing we're going to see that Bitcoin is going to ascend to a whole new level. And could it be that there is a collapse of the US dollar, and that people realize that the only thing where we can store our money is going to be in Bitcoin and gold? I mean, I'm very bullish in Bitcoin because at the end of the day, gold, it's traditionally been the store of value, but it's not very useful in terms of moving money across the world. And hence that's why we invented cash, and now we've invented electronic cash. So we are in this incredible time of Pluto and Saturn, they're ending their square, and it's been a very kind of tricky and difficult time. What I find amazing is that Uranus is going to move up to this 120-degree aspect with Pluto in 2025. Now, so there's a couple of things that all start shifting. The big shift is going to be Pluto moving out of Capricorn into Aquarius. And for me, the 20-year signature of Jupiter, Saturn that took place in 21 December 2020. So Jupiter and Saturn came together at 0 degrees of Aquarius. We're going to have Pluto move into Aquarius next year, and it's going to stay there until 2043. So in many ways, to me, this is the real dawning of the age of Aquarius. But back in the 60s, everyone was singing, this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. It's taken a bit of time. I mean, technically, astrologers debate this whole thing about when is the shift between the ages of Pisces to Aquarius. But, what is Aquarius? Aquarius is a sign of humanity. It is a sign of spirituality. It is a sign of community. It is a sign of interconnection, and it's also a sign of technology and innovation. And so is Uranus. I mean, Uranus was discovered in 1781 at the time of the Industrial Revolution. So the discovery of the planets correlates a lot with what's happening on the Earth at the time. So Uranus is now making this really harmonious aspect with Pluto in 2025, and we're gonna see the most incredible breakthroughs in technology. When I just started listening to this new Tony Robbins book called Life Force, and the first chapter is about stem cells. Well, it blew my mind. Within a very short period of time, we will all have the availability very cheaply of stem cells, which potentially will extend life by easy 10, 20 years, maybe longer. Plus, coupled with other, innovative medical procedures. I mean, the technological revolution that we're going to see within the next 5 years is going to be so dramatic. We will not recognize this planet. We will have quantum computers. We will have bioengineering. We will have nanotechnology, and let's not even forget artificial intelligence. I mean, it's so radical what's going to happen, and we can always get scared by it. A lot of people are quite fearful of AI and quite fearful of a lot of things. But all of these are tools. The real shift is there going to be a shift in human consciousness? Because at the end of the day, if we don't have a shift in human consciousness, we're not going to be able to make the tools to create a new and better world. So I want to end this talk by, and I'm sure many people have heard of the gene keys. So the gene keys, this is a printout of what's known as gene key 55. So the gene keys is based upon the I Ching, and it's based upon astrology. And the I Ching has 64 sort of patterns. They're kind of universal patterns. And gene key 55 is the most amazing gene key. It's freely available. If you don't buy the whole Gene Keys book, you can actually just download Gene Keys 55. And Gene Keys 55 gives a vision for a new humanity. And what's fascinating is that, he talks here at the beginning of Gene Key 55, he says, the coming time of the great change. Humanity is feeling this change now because it is taking place now. Within a relatively short evolutionary period, the world we are living in will be transformed into a world that most of us would consider pure fantasy. And he speaks about the year 2027, and that's not far away, being a time when children will be born with new genetics that's ultimately going to change humanity. And it's going to take a few hundred years for humanity completely to change. But we're moving into an incredible time. And there is a sort of a lot of things have to die. But when you read Gene Keys 55, and it's quite a long read, it's about 29 pages of reading, but I highly recommend you read it, because it just gives you a new sense of where we are in the world and all of these shifts and changes. So the other factor to bear in mind concerning the coming change is the speed at which it will overtake us. In evolutionary terms, it will happen overnight, although in practical temporal terms it will happen gradually and almost imperceptibly. We're talking about a genetic mutation that will slowly colonize our species. In other words, the old human will literally be bred out of humanity. And that's what we need. We need this shift in consciousness. I went and looked at the astrology of where this date 2027 came from. And the 2027 date that Richard Rudd writes here as this beginning and birth of the new humanity comes really from, again, the planets Uranus and Pluto. So Uranus was discovered in 1781, and if we take 246 years and add that to 1781, I think we get to 2029. So basically we get, it's really saying that there was this awakening that happened. There was this sort of shift in human consciousness, because before the French Revolution and the American Revolution, society was quite grim. And before the Industrial Revolution, there was also, again, very authoritarian, kind of the peasants were the peasants and the monarchy were the monarchy. And that all shifted, and there were the slaves, and things shifted. So the Great Awakener came into our consciousness. But before we can really get the full extent of the Great Awakener consciousness, we have to go through the cycle of death and rebirth, which is the cycle of Pluto. So Pluto has taken humanity through this awareness of Uranus that came in 1781, and we've gone through this full cycle, and it comes into fruition and rebirth in the year 2027, 2029, which is where I think Gene Key 55 is really getting it from. I mean, I was really into 2012 when 2012 happened. I even took my family away from the coast of Cape Town. We went inland because I thought, if there's going to be a shift, I don't want to be at the coast. But once I finally read the Gene Key 55, it was actually explained really nicely what these three sort of phases are. So basically there was a Gene Key 55 talks of harmonic convergence, which took place in August of 1987. 1987 was a very interesting year because there was a supernova. So a supernova is an exploding star. So our closest neighboring galaxy, one of the Magellanic Clouds, a star exploded, and the star was visible for months and months and months, and was the biggest supernova, and it brought basically like these exploding stars bring a shift of consciousness. And it was the first time humanity had a global meditation. It was actually at that 1987 supernova experience that the founder of the human design system kind of got his download, and human design then became, it evolved into the gene key system. So gene key 55 calls it this harmonic convergence as a gestation period. So there was this gestation period that started. And then it refers to 2012 as the melodic resonance, or sort of the birth period. And 2012, we were right in the middle of this Uranus square Pluto. So even though the whole Uranus square Pluto is a period from 2007 to 2020, the peak of that was 2012. So 2012 was this radical time of birth and a shift in human consciousness that many people were aware of, but we were expecting maybe something more physical, tangible to take place. But I've really understood now, years later, reading Gene Key 55, it's this shift in human consciousness. And then Gene Key 55 says 2027 is this rhythmic symphony when we have Uranus in trine with Pluto, and trine is a very harmonious. So I'm really expecting, what are we now? We are in 2022, 5 years away. It doesn't sound like a long time, but I've been in technology my whole life, and what is coming in the world of technology is exponential. We will not recognize this world in 5 years from now. Many of us will cure incurable diseases with the breakthrough technologies. This Tony Robbins book is blowing my mind. There is just the most radical medical procedures coming, coupled with, I've been tracking the quantum computer for years and years, and the breakthrough is coming. We will be entering, if I think of how the world changed with computers, well, quantum computers is going to change the world beyond what we can begin to even imagine. So I am excited about the future. I'm excited that there is a shift in consciousness, but, there is still some challenges. There's some major challenges coming our way. But we will have incredible technologies which we can use, and I do believe there's a shift in human consciousness, and what I'm very excited about is, if I believe this prophecy of Gene Key 55, there's a new humanity with genetic shifts coming to place where the old humanity is literally going to be bred out of existence, and we are going to enter a new world, and a new world where we can literally change and live in paradise as we're meant to live. So I'm excited, and I hope you all joining this exciting journey together. Thank you.